Hypervigilance is not a personality trait. Some people don't enter rooms, they scan them first, not consciously, not intentionally, and often not even noticeably. Their eyes move before they sit down, their attention moves before they speak. Part of them is already checking. Who's here? How does everyone seem? What's the atmosphere like? Is everything okay? Most people assume this is simply awareness. They assume it's observation. They assume it's personality. I've always been very perceptive. I just notice things. I can read people. I can read a room. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes what looks like perception is actually protection. Sometimes what looks like intuition is actually monitoring. Sometimes what looks like a personality trait began as a survival strategy. Because when emotional unpredictability becomes part of daily life, the nervous system learns something important. Pay attention. Notice everything. Stay ready. Don't miss the signs. And eventually that vigilance becomes automatic. You stop noticing that you're doing it. It becomes normal. You become the person who notices everyone's mood. The person who senses tension immediately. The person who knows something is wrong before anyone says a word. The person who can feel a shift in energy the second it happens. People often admire this. Sometimes they even compliment it. You always know what's going on. You're so aware. You're incredibly intuitive. But very few people stop to ask a deeper question. Why were you paying such close attention in the first place? Because most nervous systems do not become hyper-alert without a reason. Most nervous systems do not learn to monitor every emotional shift for no reason. There is usually a story underneath it, a history underneath it, an environment underneath it, an adaptation underneath it. And over time, that adaptation can become so familiar that it feels like identity. You don't think, my nervous system is scanning. You think, this is just who I am. Today, I want to explore that distinction. The difference between awareness and hypervigilance. The difference between intuition and monitoring. The difference between personality and adaptation. Because many people spend years trying to understand themselves while unknowingly describing survival patterns. And when survival patterns become identity, it becomes very difficult to know where the adaptation ends and where you begin. So if you've ever struggled to relax when nothing is wrong, if you've ever noticed everyone's mood before noticing your own, if you've ever felt responsible for emotional atmospheres you didn't create, if you've ever felt exhausted by constantly paying attention, this conversation may help explain why. Not because you're broken, not because you're dramatic, not because there's something wrong with you, but because awareness may have become safety long before it became identity. And understanding that distinction can change how you see yourself completely. Some people don't enter rooms, they scan them first. Hypervigilance rarely looks the way people imagine. Most people picture somebody visibly anxious, constantly worried, constantly fearful, constantly stressed. But many hypervigilant people don't appear anxious at all. In fact, they often appear highly capable, highly aware, highly responsible. They become the person everyone relies on, the person who notices details, the person who keeps things running smoothly, the person who senses problems before they happen. And because these behaviors are often rewarded, nobody recognizes them as survival responses, including the person living them. Maybe you recognize some of these experiences. You walk into a room and immediately assess the atmosphere. You notice who seems comfortable, who seems upset, who seems irritated, who seems distant. You don't have to think about it. You simply know. Maybe somebody sends a message that feels slightly different. The words are polite. Nothing obvious has happened. Yet something feels off, and suddenly your mind starts working. Did I do something wrong? Are they upset? Did something change? Did I miss something? Or perhaps you find it difficult to fully relax, not because anything is happening, but because part of you remains prepared for something to happen. You sit down to rest, but your attention remains active, monitoring, checking, waiting, listening, not necessarily for danger, but for change, for shifts, for signs, for emotional movement. Many people describe this as overthinking, but often it begins much deeper than thought. It begins in the nervous system itself. Before the mind creates explanations, before logic becomes involved, the body has already learned to stay alert. And when a body has spent years practicing alertness, relaxation can feel unfamiliar. Not unsafe exactly, just unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity often feels uncomfortable, which means even peace can feel strange. Even calm can feel suspicious. Even stability can feel temporary. Because when your nervous system was trained by unpredictability, certainty can feel harder to trust than vigilance. And that is something many people carry without realizing it. Part 2. Where the monitoring begins. Hypervigilance rarely begins in adulthood. Most of the time it begins much earlier. Long before somebody learns the word. Long before they understand nervous systems. Long before they understand emotional conditioning. It often begins in environments where emotional safety feels inconsistent. Not necessarily dangerous. Not necessarily abusive in obvious ways. Simply unpredictable. The kind of environment where you never quite know which version of somebody you're going to meet. Some days they are warm. Some days they are distant. Some days they are calm. Some days they are overwhelmed. Some days they are loving. Some days they seem emotionally unavailable. Nothing feels stable enough to fully trust. And when consistency is missing, monitoring begins. A child learns to watch, to listen, to anticipate, to prepare. Not because they are manipulative, not because they are controlling, but because adaptation is intelligent. The nervous system is always trying to create safety. If safety cannot be found through consistency, it often gets created through awareness. So the child begins paying attention. How loudly did the door close? How fast are their footsteps? What mood are they in today? Should I speak? Should I stay quiet? Should I ask for help? Should I wait? Many people grew up becoming experts in emotional weather forecasting. Not because they wanted to, because it reduced uncertainty. Because if they could predict the atmosphere, they could prepare for it. And preparation feels safer than surprise. Over time, this monitoring becomes normal. The child doesn't think, I'm learning hypervigilance. The child thinks, this is life. This is how families work. This is how relationships work. This is how people are. And because it becomes normal, it follows them into adulthood. The environment changes, but the nervous system keeps using the same strategy. The body continues scanning. The body continues monitoring. The body continues preparing, even when the original environment is gone. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of survival adaptation. People often assume that once circumstances improve, symptoms disappear. But nervous systems don't work like switches. They work through repetition. The body learns through experience. And if a nervous system spent years learning that emotional unpredictability requires vigilance, it doesn't immediately stop because life changed. The adaptation remains. The body remembers. Sometimes long after the mind has moved on. And that is why many adults find themselves exhausted by patterns they don't fully understand. They are responding to a world that no longer exists, using strategies that once made perfect sense, but now create strain. Emotional atmosphere management. Many hypervigilant people were not only monitoring emotions, they were managing them. Trying to prevent conflict, trying to reduce tension, trying to keep everyone okay, trying to stop problems before they happened. Maybe you became the peacemaker, the easy child, the mature one, the helper, the listener, the emotional caretaker. You learned very early that the atmosphere mattered, and you learned that your behavior could influence that atmosphere. So you adapted. You stayed quiet. You stayed agreeable. You stayed helpful. You stayed aware. Because awareness felt useful. Awareness felt necessary. Awareness felt responsible. But eventually responsibility expands. It grows beyond what was ever yours to carry. You stop managing situations. You start managing emotions. You stop monitoring conflict. You start monitoring people. And without realizing it, you begin feeling responsible for experiences that were never yours to control. This is where hyper-responsibility often begins. Not because somebody explicitly taught it, because it developed naturally from emotional adaptation. The nervous system learns, if I stay aware enough, maybe I can prevent problems. If I notice enough, maybe everyone will be okay. If I anticipate enough, maybe things won't go wrong. And although that strategy may have felt useful at one point, adulthood reveals its cost. Because nobody can successfully manage the emotional world around them. Eventually, the responsibility becomes too large. The monitoring becomes exhausting, and the nervous system never receives permission to rest. Part 3. When adaptation becomes identity. The most powerful survival adaptations are often the ones we stop recognizing. Not because they're hidden, because they're familiar. They become woven into identity. People begin describing themselves through the adaptation. I'm naturally anxious. I'm just an overthinker. I'm always thinking ahead. I'm highly sensitive. I am extremely aware. I'm very responsible. Sometimes these descriptions are partially true, but sometimes they are incomplete, because underneath them sits a nervous system that learned survival through vigilance. The adaptation became so automatic that it merged with self-perception. And this creates an important problem. If a survival pattern feels like personality, changing it can feel threatening. Because it doesn't feel like you're letting go of a behavior. It feels like you're letting go of yourself. Many people unknowingly resist healing for this reason, not consciously, but subconsciously. Because hypervigilance has often been with them longer than most adult relationships. Longer than careers, longer than independence, longer than conscious memory. It's familiar. It's predictable. It's known. And the nervous system naturally prefers familiar experiences, even exhausting ones. This is why some people feel strangely uncomfortable when life becomes calm. Nothing is wrong, yet they feel restless, waiting, searching, checking, monitoring. The nervous system isn't reacting to danger. It's reacting to the absence of a role it has performed for years. The monitoring role, the scanning role, the anticipating role. Without it, there can be uncertainty. Who am I if I'm not watching everything? Who am I if I'm not responsible for everyone? Who am I if I'm not constantly preparing?
These questions often emerge long before identity reconstruction begins. And for many people, they mark the moment they realize something important. Perhaps this isn't personality after all. Perhaps this is adaptation. Perhaps this is survival. And perhaps survival is not the same thing as self.
Hypervigilance often feels permanent because most people never learn to separate who they are from what they had to become. When awareness becomes survival, adaptation can start to feel like identity. And for many daughters raised in emotionally unpredictable environments, that is where the confusion begins. Not because they don't know what happened, but because they no longer know who they are underneath the monitoring. In the next episode, we're going to explore what happens when hypervigilance follows you into adulthood, how it shapes relationships, how it affects trust, why rest can feel uncomfortable, and why awareness alone is rarely enough to create lasting change. Because recognizing the pattern is only the beginning. Learning who you are beyond the pattern is where reconstruction begins. Until then, take what resonates, leave what doesn't. And remember, hypervigilance is not a personality trait. It is an adaptation. And adaptations can change.